Hi everyone, and welcome to the final week. I want to first congratulate you all on making it this far into the term. Now, the final project that you will all be doing this week is going to put all the things you've learned so far to the test. All the way from breaking things down to simple shapes, fleshing out forms by either drawing them or rendering things out, all the way to extracting compositional tools we've learned from our favorite artists. Just like I have done in the previous assignments, I've kept in mind that people taking this course have diverse backgrounds, not just in skill set and experience, but also a wide variety of goals and interests. In order to meet that demand, I have gone ahead and designed this assignment to be flexible enough that each and every one of you can get something out of it. So in order to do that, I have several demonstrations again this week, which reiterate some of the lessons we've talked about and also includes a lot of the thought process that goes into the workflow of a project. With that said, let's talk about this fun assignment that we'll be doing for our final week. Chapter 0, Final Project Options and Overview. Before we get to the demos, we need to talk about what you'll be choosing between in order to do your final assignment. I'll be giving you 3 different options, but the general formula will be the same for each one, which is basically taking your master study from week 7 and combining it with your chosen subject. So based on the techniques and lessons you have learned from doing those studies, you'll be using them as inspiration and as touchstones to complete an image. Now, let's actually talk about these 3 options. Option A is to do a still life, either from a reference photo or from observation, like a lot of you have done this term. This is the simplest choice, but it doesn't mean it's the easiest. There's still a lot of things to consider when dealing with multiple values, color, and materials when doing a still life. Option B is to do a reference study based on your goals and interests. So for example, if you want to be a character designer, you can do a figure drawing study from reference. Another useful exercise in that regard is to do a self-portrait or even go to a figure drawing workshop if you have one near where you live. Another example is if you want to be a creature designer, you can do an animal study from reference. Or if you want to be an environment designer or a background layout artist, you can find some cool photos to do your studies from, or take pictures around your town or city, or maybe even find some old vacation photos. And the third and last option is going to be the most challenging one, but also very applicable as all of you want to be some kind of designer of some sort. So option C is to do something creative, which means doing an actual character design or any sort of concept art such as prop and vehicle design. This is also open to illustration, comic books, or even a short storyboard sequence if storyboarding is something you want to do with your career in the future. The main key thing here is to design a subject that you're actually interested in. The reason this will be the most challenging option is it will require a bit more research time since you'll be creating something new. However, as I've seen on everyone's first week of homework presentation, some of you already create quite a bit of personal work. So this can be something you can apply to your current work or even challenge yourself in a way to do something a bit more creative. And not to worry, I will be doing demonstrations for each one of these options for this week. I'll also do different master studies for each sample. That way I can cover other techniques and applications to these projects. Regardless of your experience and skill set, any of these options can be viable for you depending on what you choose as your subject and of course how much time you're able to put into your work. I originally wanted to keep this final project even more open-ended, but I didn't want you all to spend half the week just trying to decide what to do. So I hope that these three specific options can save you that time and energy. And remember, pick what you think will be the most fun for you while you're learning. Without further delay, let's get on to the demonstrations. Chapter 1, Still Life Demo for Option A. For this first section, I'm actually going to do another demonstration doing a master study, which is the same thing you should have all done for week 7. Since I only covered line work from last week with the Tech on Concrete demonstration, I just want to cover a little bit of digital painting. That way, for those of you that tried it last week, you can get a few pointers, especially if you're new to the medium. For my inspiration and touchstone, I will be using Jeremy Mann's painting to study. I've been introduced to his work a few years back, and I really like the textural quality that his work presents. And the other reason I chose this painting is because when I started out, I was always a little bit too tight with my sketching and paintings, trying to make things perfect. So trying to get a little bit of inspiration from Jeremy Mann's work will definitely help trying to keep things loose and also lively, which are definitely some qualities in my work that I'm always aspiring to improve on. So when you guys are going about picking your masters to study from or get influenced by, sometimes just a matter of being inspired or finding that opposite to help balance out your skill set. Now, of course, this study is sped up for the demonstration because, again, it's something I've already covered in week 7, where we're just simply doing a master study to get a little bit of insight into their compositional choices, but also trying to learn a little bit of technique using your medium of choice and trying to replicate it by observing and copying what they've put down. So it's like a little bit of a puzzle, and we're not trying to get things too perfect. Again, we're just trying to get those important notes to help us with our overall goal, which is to complete our own artwork, whether it be from imagination or reference. Now for this painting in particular, I'm just going to be using mostly 1 or 2 layers. And the reason is, since Jeremy Mann's edges are rough and loose, I don't have to worry about lassoing or marking off edges to get a clean shape. Since I'm doing a quick digital study, I know it's not going to be perfect and look exactly like this oil painting, which he spent, several days or even weeks trying to finish up. But at the start of this study, I'm just using whatever brushes I have in my disposal. Some of them I've collected through just different areas on the web. But when you download your own brushes, whether you get them for free or you buy them, or maybe you just find them through the amazing library that Photoshop already has, what you want to do is just test out different brushes in the beginning to see what closely replicates the artwork that you're copying. And part of the fun is just trying to figure that out. And along the way, you might actually come up with a certain brush that might work for a different painting. Now for this first part, I'm definitely just trying to get the overall composition. As you can see, I've been working small by zooming out as much as I can, because I'm trying to figure out how he's showcasing his focal points. And this one's pretty clear. Like, he's using the street lines. It's kind of a V shape that points to, the far distance of like the city, and you can see the sky. And you can see the tail lights of the cars. They basically lead towards the sort of focal point. And if you look towards the outside edges or the bottom edges of the painting, you'll notice there aren't that many things defined in there, which is basically the opposite that I realized he was using while I was studying his work. Is he's playing with the opposites of defined areas and things that are a little bit more vague. So for this first half of this demo, I'll be just focusing on the overall big picture. And even for those of you that are able to spend maybe 15 to 20 hours doing a study for the week, we're not going to get it super perfect. So what I'm going to do soon is zoom in and try to find an area that's a good sample to get a wide variety of different materials or values, or maybe color, to try to replicate. And then I could try to find how he's defining some areas, like places that are lit, areas with shadows, and what kind of things he's using for his edges. So just remember, you want to work from large to small. And especially if you're on a limited time, you can start off with just a cropped part of the image to start off your study. You only want to do the overall image if you're trying to study the composition, but you can do that fairly quickly with a thumbnail, as we saw in week 6. But when we're trying to learn technique, we're trying to replicate how the tools are affecting the look of the surface of an artwork. So it's okay to just do a little sample. That way we can see how he's treating all the other parts of a painting or a drawing, depending on who and what you're studying from. So as you see here now, I've zoomed in to a specific area that I want to do a more detailed study of. This way I can get the proper technique, and when I do my actual still life, I can start thinking about how to showcase some of the material or the focal point, or even just how to treat some of the edges and light and shadow. And I've cropped in this particular area because after doing the study, I felt like this was the best overall sample that I can find a variety of edges, a variety of values, and just a variety of surfaces as well. This might be a bad idea if I cropped in an area of this painting where nothing was really defined, such as the bottom of the painting that I showed, where the street was really abstract looking and a little bit vague. But this has those areas that are not as defined as well versus the areas that are very defined. So when I zoomed in, I didn't realize how much detail was in the back of this particular car. Even though you can't see the actual letters of the license plate, it's basically suggested in there with those really nice reflections. While I won't get the exact colors or shapes and placement, I'm at least trying to sample out what kind of brushes I can use for my still life to sort of get some of the qualities that he has into my own work. And then from here, when I started defining some of the lights and the areas of the windows, I started to feel pretty comfortable on, what he was doing and how I can replicate it with the certain brushes that I found. Even though there were a few other lessons I think I could still learn from completing other areas of the study, I felt pretty satisfied and comfortable moving on to the actual still life from here. So based on the studies you guys did last week, if you feel like you didn't give it enough time and you want to reinvestigate some of the techniques they were using, rework it and get it to the point where you can comfortably try to apply it to your own personal work for this week. This now concludes this quick demonstration on this master study for Jeremy Mann's painting. And now I'm going to move on to the actual still life to apply some of these techniques. This is basically where your final project begins. Just like I have here, it's a good idea to have the original master artwork off to the side, as well as your master studies that you did, so you can kind of refer back to it when you need to check the techniques again on how you can apply it to your own personal painting. But for this page, I also have the still life image that I'll be doing the painting of. And just like you've all learned throughout the weeks, we are going to start off with some quick thumbnails. Straight off the bat, I started to think about where I want my focal point to be. And with the setup I made, I have the lighting in a way where it's basically just creating a highlight into that ceramic bowl with the holes in it. So immediately I know I wanted my focal point to just be in that area. So as you saw my second thumbnail, I roughly used the rule of thirds to place that object accordingly. But even with just 3 thumbnails, I try to make sure they're all a little bit different in terms of their composition. So when I look back at the reference image, I try to look at the shadow patterns or maybe some of the light areas to see what I can use in terms of composition. Now I know we didn't go over it, but I will be doing these thumbnails and the final in color. Since this isn't a dedicated digital painting course, or let alone a color and lighting course, you can simply do this painting in black and white, which I highly recommend, especially if you really want to work on just values and edges. That way you don't have this other major element to have to juggle when you're doing your painting. But for those of you that want to give it a try, you are more than welcome to do so, and I'll give some pointers during your feedback. And even when you take a digital painting course or any kind of color and lighting course, sometimes they give you these master study assignments as well. And this is a great way to work up to those classes, especially if you want to get more into painting in general. But the main thing here is I basically just blocked in the values and color the same way we've done all the other assignments in black and white. So you want to start in the big general shapes and work your way down to the smaller details, thinking about your focal point and where you want the viewer to look. Before I move on to the final painting, I just want to show a quick tip on turning your images in black and white for you to double check your values. So first off, you're going to make a new layer and put it at the very top of the stack. Next, while you're on that layer, you're going to go to Edit, down to Fill, or Shift F5. You're going to pick a black and white value. So whether it's white, gray, or black, you just want to make sure it doesn't have any color. Once you apply it, that whole layer will be applied by that value. Next, while you're choosing that layer, you're going to go to Layer Properties. You're going to scroll down to the Color option, which will in turn affect all the layers underneath and sort of color it in black and white. I've noticed it works the same with both the Hue and Saturation layer option. And there's many ways to turn an image into black and white, but as some of my colleagues have pointed out, if you just drop the saturation down on that particular layer, it sometimes can change the values. That's just a quick tip and one of many ways to turn your images into black and white, and this can be very useful for future applications. And in my case, the reason I wanted to see it in black and white, I wanted to make sure that my values were reading fairly well in terms of my compositional design, especially before moving on to the final. Actually, while we're at it, I'm going to show you a few more things in Photoshop. Now you'll notice here that I did my thumbnails in 4 separate layers, where I have a layer with the line work, the background, and some of the paintings. Now I can easily just merge these layers or flatten them out in order to copy and transfer them. But another thing you could do that's really useful is to copy all the layers at once. That way you can easily transfer them. So here I'm just going to get the marquee tool. I'm going to select the thumbnail that I'm going to be using for my final. So I'm going to wrap it around. And next you're going to hit Control Shift C, or if you're on a Mac, it should be Command Shift C. And then from there, it'll copy all the layers underneath as well. And then you can just hit Control V for paste or Command V. And now you have a copy of those images without having to merge all those layers. That isn't a big secret or anything, and I'm sure some of you already know that. But for those of you that don't, hopefully you find that helpful and useful if you're new to the digital medium. And the main reason I needed to do that is I wanted to select the overall proportion for my frame, and I could easily just copy this thumbnail onto my new canvas where I'm going to do my final. And here my proportions are laid out because of the selection I made. So when I'm making a new file or canvas, you can easily see the pixel height and width of your selection. And from here, since I know that it's going to be a final painting, I want to make sure that the pixel width and height is adequate. I'm actually just going to double up on the pixels from the thumbnail, which is close to 2000 pixels wide. And for the type of painting I'm doing, that should be enough. And then from here, it's pretty much the home stretch. So I set up my workspace accordingly, making sure I have all my references and my master studies handy so I can keep referring back to them as I go through this painting. And I have to admit, when I did my thumbnails, they went a lot quicker than I planned on doing. And sometimes, that doesn't always work out that way. So before you get to this point, you want to make sure that your thumbnails are at a level where you've worked out your composition the best you can. Because from here on, a lot of the big decisions have already been made in terms of what I wanted to capture for my design. And the main thing I have to do now is just to render things out and apply the techniques I learned from doing the Jeremy Mann study. So when I'm going about this painting, I basically just want to keep reiterating the focal point as much as I can. And of course I want to stay as close to the actual values of my painting as that was my intention when I did the setup myself. But one thing I'm trying to do for sure is move around in different parts of the painting as much as I can. That way I don't get stuck on just rendering one section. Because I know for my habits, that's a certain pitfall I have sometimes, is just working on one spot too long and I over render it. So to stay close to that kind of style that Jeremy Mann is doing with all the textural qualities, I'm basically just going back to the brushes that I used to do the study. And the nice thing about them is they don't have a clean edge, so I can't be too finicky with my shapes and forms. And from here, a lot of the colors were already determine in my thumbnail. So I'm actually just color picking for my own painting already. There will be times when I'll use the slider to the right to change some colors, change the hue a little bit, make it a little bit warmer or cooler, depending on what section of the painting I'm on. And as you see too, I'll be zooming in and out a lot just to kind of double check my composition and if I'm forgetting or losing anything. And from here, I'm also trying to remind myself what makes the Jeremy Man's painting look the way it does. And I remember, keeping things vague in certain areas where it's not the focal point. So I'm not trying to describe all the cloth that the objects are on. I'm trying to keep them very loose and gestural. But in the areas where I want the viewers to look, I want to define those areas a little bit more. Meaning I'll think about the top plane, the side plane, or maybe if there's a little tiny shadow or a lot more texture, I'm going to define them. And little bits here and there, I'll start to see some of the things we've been learning this term, like reflected light or some of the core shadows. And the more I can put into the focal point, finding those areas of light, those are useful information that I can show the viewer so they can kind of just keep looking at that area. And when I was getting to this point, I noticed that I was starting to revert back to my old habits. So I try to zoom out as much as I can, and I would flip my canvas as well. And sometimes I would force myself to use a very texture or wild brush just to make sure I'm not falling into those, trying to make it overly rendered or overly defined. And I'm also taking some artistic licenses, again, thinking about my focal point. So sometimes I'll not look at my reference anymore, where I'll just look at my artwork and ask myself, what does this need in order to emphasize the focal point a little more? Or is there an area that needs to be defined? Because it's maybe too confusing to the viewer, where I don't want it to be. Sometimes I'll even push areas where there's reflected light. And that's the reason I also want you guys to try setting up your own still lifes. Is because, taking a picture will actually flatten out some of the colors and values. So even though I am looking at this photograph, but this is a setup that was actually done in my garage. So I took note of some of the colors that I saw in the reflected light, and I'm punching it up in my own painting. And that's the advantage of doing studies from life, because you can actually get more color and more values that you can use for your artwork. Now, of course, the con to that is there might be too much information. And if you're not sure what to leave out versus what to put in, then there's too many things to deal with. For this week, I've provided new still life images in the lecture notes section for you guys to choose from. They are in color, but just like I showed you, if you want to take color out as a factor, definitely just do them in black and white. and you can still learn plenty from that when you have to deal with correct value relationships and also dealing with soft versus hard edges. So there's plenty of lessons to be learned, even in just that regard. In these last moments of this piece, as you can see, I'm also checking the black and white values. And from here, I've worked on it for about an hour in terms of just doing the final painting. So definitely spend as much time as you want and need to get the most out of this final project. But for me, this demonstration is finished, and I know if I keep working on it, it's just going to keep getting more refined, and it'll probably stray too far from my initial goal, which is to make it look similar to the Jeremy Mann technique. But I hope you found this helpful in how to approach a little bit of the painting aspect when it comes to doing the master study, and also getting a little bit of an intro or preview for those of you that want to get into more digital painting in the future. Chapter 2, Reference Study for Option B. Just like I mentioned in the introduction, for this option, you'll be picking a reference study based on your goals and interests. So some of you guys want to be character designers. Some of you may want to be environment artists. This is a chance to really grow your skill set, especially towards the field you want to eventually get into. Now, I know there will be a number of you who are undecided on what topic they want to focus on in the field, or maybe you want to do a little bit of everything and can't decide. However, you definitely have some favorite artists that you guys admire, and whichever master study you did for week 7, you can basically just pick a subject matter that they're using in their artwork that you can pick and do a study off of. Or perhaps the study you did, you just like the technique, just as you saw in my previous demo, where I did the Jeremy Mann painting. Even though it was a cityscape, I applied it to a still life. So if one of the master studies you did happened to do an environment art, you can also apply it to a character design. So you can mix and match or pick a very similar subject to what's already given in the artwork that you studied. And I'm predicting that this will be the most popular option for this final project, because a lot of you want to take more classes and are not quite sure on what you're interested in quite yet. So this is a good chance to kind of get your feet wet and do a little test run on a given subject matter. So even if you're completely new to some of these subjects, but you're curious about it, go ahead and give it a try. This chapter's video is going to be a little bit quicker than the previous one. The reason being that the master study that I'll be using is the one I did for week 7's demonstration. So based off of the Tankon Kincrete artwork that I studied last week, I learned quite a bit in terms of how they were using their line quality to showcase certain details and sort of the old and worn out look that they were able to put in their pieces. As you'll see here, I'm also doing something a little bit different. Now this is completely optional, but what I'm doing is I'm going to be using several references to complete one image. Now for this option B, when you guys pick out your reference, you just need to pick one good one. But I definitely want to keep it open into showing you how you can put your own images together. Because often when you find reference online or take photos for yourself, you're not going to get the perfect scenario. So what I'm doing here with my thumbnails, I'm trying to find a way to showcase my focal point, and I've decided to make it this artillery gun. And these are a set of photos that I took during a field trip many years ago when I took dynamic sketching. We're fortunate enough here in Southern California that we have a military museum that showcases all of these World War II tanks and other military vehicles. So if you guys ever decide to take dynamic sketching 1 and 2, these are the sort of subjects you'll be drawing. So what I'm using with the other references here, I'm trying to find a better background because my main subject just has a wall and a bunch of other junk around it. So I'm trying to find ways to create a sort of landscape around it so it can be showcased, just like what I learned in the master study, where they're using the environment to point into the focal point, which was the car in that case. So in this one, I'm trying to find trees, rocks, even bushes, other the railings, as you can see on some of them, just so I can use it to point to my subject or even frame it. So this is a scenario where you're constantly editing, and it's almost like putting a still life together, except, since you can't move the actual objects, you'll just have to put the shapes and forms together and kind of composite them in. But without any Photoshop tricks, all you have to do is sketch it in. Now again, this is completely optional, but for those of you that want to give this a try, where you're combining a few different references to make a scene. And this kind of leads, and this is a good practice before you do any sort of creative work. When you're creating your own characters or vehicle designs, this is a good exercise in terms of learning how to put things together. This is definitely great for environment design, as you'll try to look for things around the natural environment or location and just try to find ways to make a better setting. And one thing you'll notice about these line thumbnails, I kept them as loose as I can, mainly because I was mainly concerned about the composition. And I have to admit, it was quite a struggle on this one. I was having a tough time trying to figure out how to showcase my main subject. And even the long vertical format, which I'll be choosing, at first I didn't think it was going to be a thumbnail I'll be using anyway. But after giving it a shot, I saw that it could potentially be a really cool composition. So when you guys do your thumbnails, even if you think you're not going to use a certain design or format, or maybe the way you're cropping things, just give it a try. You'll never know what you come up with, and the time invested in it is relatively short, but will save you a lot of time in the long run. But it could also lead to some happy accidents where you have a better design, or to come up with something pretty fresh. Just as I mentioned, I've gone ahead and picked the vertical format for my composition. And even though my lay-in is very loose and not perfectly fleshed out, I have the major shapes and where I want them to be. And you'll see me make changes along the way, how I want to showcase my main focal point. I'll also do a little bit of recropping because I underestimated some of the proportions for the artillery gun. This part of the drawing was definitely the slowest and most difficult for me, as I was constantly trying to check my proportions and trying to figure out what's going on in my reference. And that's why this part of the video is the fastest I've sped up any of my demonstrations. If you are curious, this one's sped up at about 20 times the speed. And this isn't even the final drawing in terms of line work. This is a second lay-in where I'm actually refining the drawing. As you'll see here, the wheels definitely gave me the most challenge as I was trying to do them freehand. Just as we saw from week 2, they are definitely the hardest to draw. But again, it just takes a lot of mileage and practice. And the thing about wheels, just like in figure drawing, you want to get the head and face proportions correctly. So for vehicles, you want to get the wheels correct. Otherwise, everything just kind of falls apart. But once I got my main subject blocked in, I started to get a sigh of relief and things were actually working out. It was definitely a lot more of a struggle. And there were even moments in this demonstration where I almost started to regret what kind of subject I picked. Because I haven't drawn this one yet, and there's definitely a lot of things going on because of all the negative shapes and the amount of kind of detail that's on there. But that's kind of what you have to go through with any kind of work. There's always going to be a certain period in the beginning, where it feels like it's not going to go anywhere. But as long as you kind of push through that, you'll see eventually that it can actually get somewhere. And at the very least, you'll learn a few things. And since my main subject is blocked in already, I ended up doing a little bit of recropping, also just drawing out some information to help support the main subject in my composition. So I'm drawing things in the foreground or the background to help either frame or point to the main subject. At this point, I could finally zoom in to my picture. This will be the third and final layer, which will be my final lines. So I'm going to have my Tech on Kincrete master study handy to the side. And also and I was also constantly looking at the art book so I can look at the line quality. And just like the Jeremy Mann painting, I'm constantly trying to remember what brushes I was using for the pencil look. And again, they were default brushes from Photoshop. And I believe one of them is called the wax pencil. Now the thing about the pencil brushes, they do affect the performance of Photoshop. And that's kind of one of the disadvantages when I was working on this. Things were starting to lag on me versus the actual painting that I did in the previous demo. Despite using a larger brush and a few more layers, things were a lot smoother when I was painting. Since the pencil brush uses multiple layers of its own sort of texturing, there's a lot more that your machine has to compute. So I often don't use them. And there were moments when I just had to turn off a few things in the background in order to free up some memory, just so I can draw a little bit smoother. And see, that's the sort of thing you don't have to worry about when you're drawing with a simple pencil or a pen. And again, this is kind of one of the main subjects you'll draw for dynamic sketching. Maybe not this one in particular, this one's really difficult, but you'll draw some classic cars, some tanks, which are a lot bulkier and have simpler shapes. And then for dynamic sketching 1 in particular, here at CGMA, you'll start off with organics, mainly with plants, and a lot of drawing exercises that really help with your draftsmanship skills. You'll see me zooming in and out a lot because I started to work on the background, trying to figure out what to draw for the foreground areas as well. So I'm actually just trying to design some shapes. I am looking at my other references. I noticed there was mud, some rocks, some grass, different parts of the trees. And I'm not trying to copy them exactly. All I'm doing is taking cue of what's in the environment, and I'm creating a shape, just like we did in week 1 and 2, where we were trying to design some abstract shapes to make something look interesting, or something that has a focal point. So basically you are just putting these abstract shapes, and then you're putting a little bit of context to them by saying this isn't just a triangle anymore. This is now a puddle of mud with some rocks on it, and it just happens to be shaped like a triangle. But what it is, it just points to your main subject. So that's the biggest difference between just copying something versus communicating visually through drawing and painting, where you're actually designing things out to be clear to the viewer. It's easier said than done, but those are the kind of things you're going to run into when you take a new class, whether it be for a character design or environment. You're always trying to solve problems in terms of communicating something visually to tell a story or to showcase a certain subject. In this last stretch, I'm actually zooming out a lot and also constantly looking at the art book and also my master's study, just so I can get that final look and that final touch on the technique to make it similar enough that it's pretty clear that I was influenced by it. Now, it's not going to be 100%, and I have my own sensibilities and artistic style, but the reason I did this master's study is because I want to incorporate that more into my own work. And it's pretty much the same way as a musician has several influences in terms of their favorite artists as well. And then in turn, when they make their own music, you can get little hints of those styles into their own creations, which we are hoping to do with this assignment. Chapter 3, Creative Assignment for Option C. Here we are with the final demo of the term. This will be a quick introduction on a process for doing some creative work. And just like the previous options, we will still be using our master studies to help add that extra ingredient to help push our work to the next level. To start off, you want to pick a subject you want to create, such as a character design, environment design, prop design, illustration, or whatever it is that interests you. It can also be something related to your personal work. Most of you have shared the type of work you do during the first week's assignment, so you can actually use that here, where you take what you learned from your favorite artist and try to apply it to something you've created before. However, if you're making something completely new, which is most likely what you'll be going for if you pick this creative option, I will demonstrate on how to go about planning and researching before we put everything together. As artists, all of us have gotten stuck on a blank page or canvas at one time or another. When you start any creative prompt or assignment, it's usually best to plan ahead, brainstorm ideas, and do research accordingly to get things going. For this demonstration, I've decided to design a mech of some sort. It's probably due to the fact that I just recently did the study of the artillery gun in the previous demo, and feeling a bit inspired to do something sci-fi oriented. It's been a long while since I've designed any sort of mech or robot, but with the steps I'll be showing you all, I think I might be able to pull something off. When it comes to putting down ideas, however, it's best to be as specific as possible, because if I just put down, I want to design a mech robot, it can go in a wide variety of directions, which in turn can still lead to a blank page at the end of the day. So what I'm going to do to help with that is to preview and borrow some of the things I've helped co-teach in 2 other classes here at CGMA. In particular, dynamic sketching with lectures by Patrick Ballesteros, and fundamentals of design with Tyler Edlin. So with Patrick, he likes to give a certain prompt for one of his vehicle redesign assignments, which is to design a kaiju cleanup machine. And with Tyler's design course, he has you lay out assignments where you add certain words to further modify your prompts. For example, I've listed certain adjectives and feelings to my mech prompt in order to come up with a more specific idea. And the more you specify your idea, the more efficient your research will be, and you will set yourself up for a clearer and stronger design. After all that explanation, I ended up settling with this prompt, which is I want to design a kaiju cleanup mech that feels agile. So those are my modifier words. Now I have a very specific goal in mind that will help me with my research. So a kaiju refers to these large monsters such as Godzilla. And the thing to imagine is, after these giant monsters fight each other and the city's in total destruction, there needs to be some kind of cleanup crew. So I started off by researching a bunch of vehicles such as fire trucks, construction vehicles, and even some heavy industrial cleaning machines. This started to give me a good idea on what to look for in terms of form and function. And then on the other end, when I was thinking of the word agile, the first thing that came to me was a bunch of different animals such as birds and even this tree frog, where they're agile by nature, and they have these certain shape language that kind of conveys that as well. I also picked this scene from The Last Samurai because I thought the armor was really cool and the color scheme. So that's something I was thinking about when I was thinking the word agile, and just what kind of shapes, color, and forms can convey that feeling. After all that research, we can finally start doing some thumbnails. Starting off, I just made a straight line because I know I wanted to make some mechs in a sort of profile view. And the reason for that is I don't want to have to deal with perspective because that's too much to think about. So if you guys are doing some kind of character design, creature design, vehicle design, it's best to do a very profile view, or just for character, of course, something maybe frontal. That way you don't have to deal with any sort of action poses where you have to deal with foreshortening and perspective. You just want to deal with mainly shapes in the beginning and thinking about their silhouettes. So based on my research and thinking about my words, which I have up in front of me, I just try to convey certain shapes that make it look like a mech, but also shows these certain words, such as the agility and certain functions that this mech might have. So often when students do character designs, what ends up happening is they want to have a character do all sorts of things. Instead of giving that character a specific job in the beginning, that way they have a clear function and design, and that's something that we can relate to right away. But sometimes when there's too many things that a certain character can do, maybe it's certain superpowers, or maybe something about the costume or personality. So just like mixing all colors evenly and you get muddy colors, if you have too much of everything, things will be unclear, therefore creating a weaker personality. So when I started these thumbnails, it took a while to warm up. Like the first one just has a simple silhouette. Then I started getting into more line and just graphics. They're not necessarily shadows, but just areas where I want the first reads or focal points to be. And even though I'm not designing in a frame, like an illustration or some kind of landscape painting, I'm still thinking about a focal point or how the eye will move and travel around these abstract shapes. So just like a thumbnail composition, these thumbnail mechs, I'm rearranging these shapes and forms and sometimes dealing with values. So I'm juggling those different things, such as the function, what makes this feel agile, thinking about proportions, and also just kind of what looks appealing, what looks cool. And again, if I just had a simple prompt like I want to design a mech, I would have no direction in terms of keywords for doing some research. And I'm going to have too many different thumbnails that might even contradict each other. So spending the time in the beginning in the ideation and research is going to speed up your creative process, down the line. And even though I limited myself to these words, it doesn't mean I can't change them, because usually through the creative process, it's not a clear cut, 1, 2, 3. Often you'll find something new within your thumbnails, which I did in some of these areas where I feel like I can save it for a new idea in the future, and I'll just make note of it. Or sometimes I'll think about an area where all of a sudden I need to find new research for it. I'll pause what I'm doing, I'll look online and try to look into different things that popped into my head. So the creative process is definitely not linear in a sense, where you have to be flexible enough, but at the same time, it's good to have a certain process down. That way you can produce, especially when you're in a time crunch and at work, you're expected to come up with several designs within a day or within a week, depending on your project, and you need to come up with results. So having something you could fall back into in terms of process is a great thing, but definitely constantly try to experiment as you continue designing all sorts of things in your education and your career as well. But just to talk about some of the thumbnails I'm doing, so I started going into more 3/4 views and a little bit of perspective. I just wanted to play around with the shapes a little bit more. And as you can see on some of these, I'm starting to think about maybe some kind of tank, like a water tank. And this mech has to hose things down, to kind of wash things. I even have a mech here. There's kind of a scrubber on its arm. Maybe it needs to scrub things up because of all the kaiju mess all over the city. And along the process, I even was tempted to do some sort of tank treads. But then I kept reminding myself, like, okay, you're trying to go for agile, and tank treads don't feel agile. They usually feel heavy because they're tanks. That's how they are. And that's how, as an audience, we can relate to it. So I'm definitely not using those shapes. I'm using shapes that are more bird-like. So for the legs, they get skinnier at the end. And also just like the frog, they have really stronger upper legs or thighs. That way it feels a little bit strong but springy at the same time. So there's a lot of weaponry mech out there, and I'm definitely not an expert on mech design, but I've done my fair share in classes in the past, so I'm using those skills here. And for my purposes, usually I would do more thumbnails than this, but as a demo, I hope you guys found this useful in starting up your creations based on your research. Because from here, I'm going to pick one. I'm going to start painting it up a little bit, just like my chosen master study. For my master study, I decided to copy Yuan Yuglow's technique. I'm just going to show you the main steps I did in order to try out his technique. Starting off with some colored line work, because I noticed that there were some lines in there that were reddish brown, so I just started off with that. The second step, I basically just put some of the local values. His style is kind of mass oriented, where he has very strong local value separation. And then the third step, I started to flesh it out, getting the subtle differences in the colors, but making sure not to put too much contrast. And the nice thing about doing the study from Yuglow's work was I actually ended up using brushes I never did before and found new ways to achieve this look by tweaking a few settings and finding different ways to use some of the brushes I already had. And I came to about 3 main brushes that had a certain texture to it to achieve that look, which I used to accent on this last step, getting the darker lines and also some of the lighter lights to get that sort of glow and texture in those bright areas. But I hope this helps, seeing it in a different way versus the time-lapse video, and just kind of seeing the main steps as I try to achieve the look from Yuglow's work. And here we are in the final stretch of the final demo of the term. So just like the previous one in chapter 2, I just got my overall lay-in thumbnail, enlarged it on a separate file. That way I don't have to rework the proportions. And more importantly to me is the gestural quality that was in the thumbnail. Because often the tricky thing about working from a thumbnail or some kind of gesture study, whether it's a character design or environment design, is when you start finalizing the work, trying to render it up and get it towards finish, what ends up happening to even the professionals is things start to stiffen up. That sort of initial liveliness to it goes away. So it's definitely hard to achieve when you're cleaning things up, but usually the best way is to refer back to your thumbnail as much as you can and try to extract those qualities that came from it. Now, of course, we also need to knock out some of the bad qualities that were in there. Because later on, like I realized in this thumbnail, like it only had 2 legs. Because it was a profile view, but I wanted to have a more dynamic 3/4 view, at least with the legs. Because the overall mech or machine that I'm designing is mostly in profile. I go back to the layer with my lay-in and rework that silhouette to figure out where the other legs should go. And part of it is just figuring out how this is going to stand up and balance, but also trying to create a nice looking silhouette through thinking about avoiding tangents or just creating an exciting looking shape. Those are all like design elements, and it just comes with trial and error. And you'll notice why I have all my references in the back. Once in a while, I'll also have a few other references that I look at off screen, because I'm constantly trying to search other images that might pop up in my head really quickly if I need to look something up as I'm going through with the line work. Because there's areas where I get really confused, like how I should design or define an area. And as much as I can, I want to avoid a lot of guesswork. I don't want to try to have to hide stuff that I don't understand. But even then, with my limited time of designing mechs and spaceships and things of this nature, there's still a lot of things I'm not sure about, and we'll need a lot of time to continue studying and practicing designing this sort of thing. So this was definitely great mileage for me. And one of the things I noticed in my references, just to kind of make this feel a little bit more believable, is just putting some kind of number or logo on this as well to kind of add to the storytelling or the function of this vehicle. Now that I've finished up the majority of the line work, I'm starting to prepare a bit of coloring on this and painting up some of the local values. And I wanted a nice graphical read, so I definitely brought up the master study as a reference again, just to kind of remind myself how to approach this going forward. I would have liked to flesh that out a little bit more, but for the purpose of this demo, and also in sort of the loose and lively quality that the master study presented, I wanted to be able to capture that in a sort of a sketchy and painterly way. So I was looking at a lot of custom modern motorcycles and a lot of the color schemes they have. And I really like the gray and orange color scheme. I would have left it like this for personal work, but in terms of actually designing something and making it a functional working mech, where it's sort of in the cleaning and construction department, this needs to relate to our audience in that way, so they know they're not looking at a hostile military mech or just something for a sports use like a motorcycle. So after I work around the background and foreground areas, trying to paint it as simple as the Ugolo study, I try to scrap the original. I tried to experiment with some of the more construction vehicle colors, painting it up yellow. At first I didn't really like it, but then I started looking at the wasp that was also in my reference. And besides the agile quality that the wasp has, it also has the aggressiveness to it. So just like the wasp, putting in some of the black and orange patterns kind of help. But I also try to experiment with other colors as well, trying some green stripes, lighter areas for the water tank, things like that. So I'm using the color to also tell the function of this mech. So think of it like your character designs. You're not just putting random colors that look cool, but think about their jobs or their personality or even their environment. You know, they might be on a certain team or class or society that dictates, what they wear. So just as I found in my reference with the sirens on the fire truck, I put the red siren on top of the mech. I put a hard hat color on the technician. And also put some red on the ends of the feet of the mech. Because if looking at the vehicles, there's always like safety warnings, making sure that the people working with these machinery have some warnings, where the danger areas are. So I know we're in the last stretch, but there's definitely a lot of things I still wanted to do with this design. It was a lot of fun. And even with the master study, I feel like I haven't quite painted this up all the way to, that type of style. But working this way has definitely pushed my work in a different way. Like I'm using brushes I've never tried. I'm separating my local values a lot more, where I would go straight into lighting before. And here I'm just trying to think about the mass and texture and just kind of letting things go, keeping things loose. And I'm going to call this one finished for the demonstration. I hope this was enough to help you get started if you choose this option. Since it's the beginner class, I don't expect everyone to choose this one, but for those that want an extra challenge or have more time to do some research and even prepare for some of the classes you're looking to take in the future, this is a great assignment to try out. And with that said, I will conclude this week and also the term. So I want to thank all of you for making it this far and for signing up for my class. I hope you learned a thing or two to help prepare you, for the rest of your artistic goals, whether it be for a class or your career. And as usual, I'm excited and looking forward to seeing the kind of work you do for this final week. And before you rush off to doing your final project, let's just do a quick summary of what's expected for this week. So all you have to do is pick one of the following options and mix your master study that you did from week 7, as I showed in the demonstrations for this week. When you do the still life option, make sure you do at least 3 thumbnails before jumping into the final artwork you're going to do, whether you're going to draw it out or paint it up, depending on the style you chose and medium. And for option B, the same is pretty much expected, where you'll have a few thumbnails before you move on to your reference study. And again, for the reference study, just as I mentioned in the demo, you only need to pick one reference to do your artwork from. But I'm also giving the option to combine a few references in order to make something a little bit different. So it is a bit more challenging that way, but it will help you practice some creative aspects, teach you the lessons of editing and taking some artistic license, and prevent you from just copying what's in front of you. And then of course, the third and final option is to make some kind of design. You can create your own character, make an illustration. Some of you have shown me your personal work and they're definitely creative already. So you can apply some of the lessons you learned from the masters and improve on your own personal work. So if you do that, make sure you include like a before and after, but also when you're creating something new, make sure you include your thumbnail sheets. And I want to say at least one reference sheet. If you have more, you can definitely include it on a second or third page. But we can go over specifics during the Q&A sessions, or you could always write it down in the forums. In the lecture notes section, I have included all the demos I did in JPEG format, so you can refer back to them. I've also included several new still life images for you all to draw and paint from. Whether you are using my photos or setting up your own still life, make sure you include a photo with your thumbnails for option A. That way, I can critique it accordingly. And as you're seeing on the screen, since this is the final project, you want to make sure your name is on your artwork. And you could also do a bit of formatting and make your presentation a little bit nicer if you'd like, because you never know if CMGA chooses your artwork as a sample for future students to look at. I hope you find this final project fun and inspiring, as I wanted to make sure there was enough challenge and variety for the diverse group that we have for this class. And all of these exercises should definitely help prepare you for the classes you want to take in the future, and should also keep you busy if you just want to do a lot more of these exercises to continue to master your draftsmanship and compositional skills. So have fun this week, good luck on your final project, and I'll see you guys during the feedback and Q&A.